The Sleeping Beauty by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, in a far country, there lived a king and queen whose joy in life became complete when they had a lovely baby girl. So happy were they that they decided to have the grandest feast anyone had ever heard of to celebrate the baby's christening. It was well known that there were 7 good fairies in the land, and the king invited them all to be present at the great event, hoping that each would bless the baby with some good gift. On the day of the christening, the palace was at its most resplendent. Light shone even to the highest tower. To the strains of exquisite music, fountains tinkled in basins of snow-white marble, and the fragrance of 1,000 flowers rose to perfume the air. The baby princess herself lay in a cradle of gold, amid coverlets woven of rose-petal silk. The royal guests, gorgeously robed, seated themselves at the gleaming banquet tables, and everyone applauded as the 7 good fairies, looking like rainbow-tinted angels, came winging into the great hall and stood smiling around the royal cradle. "My gift to the little princess," said the first fairy, "shall be beauty. She will be the loveliest lady in the land." "I," said the second, "bestow upon her the gift of intelligence." "She shall have the sweetest disposition in the world," declared the third. The fourth wished her the grace of a flower, "and the voice of a nightingale," added the fifth. "And from me," said the sixth, "she shall have the gift of making music on any musical instrument she touches." So happy were the king and queen and all the guests that no one noticed the arrival of an evil old witch who had slipped into the banquet hall while the sixth fairy was speaking. The witch had, of course, not been asked to the princess's christening, and she was angry at the slight. She stood in a shadowy corner at the banquet hall, waiting for a chance to make trouble. Now, she figured the time had come. Although it turned out that she was mistaken, she thought the last wish had been made by the 7th fairy. So, stepping forth, her face ugly with hatred, she said to the king and queen, "Huh? You think I am not good enough to be a guest at your daughter's christening? You despise me. Well, I'll get even with you. I am now going to make a wish that will be a lifelong curse upon your child. This is it. One day she will try to spin at a spinning wheel. When she does, the spindle will prick her finger and she will immediately fall dead." So saying, the evil witch disappeared, the sound of her airy laughter echoing in the ears and in the hearts of the horrified guests. A terrible hush fell on the christening party, which had been so gay but a moment before. The poor king and queen were all but out of their minds with grief. But lo, suddenly there appeared the 7th of the good fairies, who, as you remember, had not yet wished her gift on the little princess. In a voice as clear and lovely as a silver bell, she said, "Unfortunately, I have no power to undo the curse the evil witch has just put upon the princess. The girl's finger, alas, will be pricked by a spindle, but I decree that when that happens, she will only seem to fall dead. Actually, she will be in a deep sleep a sleep so deep that it will last 100 years, long enough to make the evil witch consider her dead. But during those 100 years, the princess will remain as young and beautiful as she is on the day she falls asleep. She will be known, therefore, as the Sleeping Beauty, and when the 100 years are over, she will be awakened by a prince who will have the power to break the witch's spell. With these words, the fairy joined her sisters, and all seven disappeared in a rainbow-colored mist. As the little princess grew older, all the good fairy's wishes came true. She was beautiful, intelligent, sweet, kind, thoughtful, and graceful, and she was wonderfully well versed in music and all the arts. Everyone loved her. Of course, no one ever whispered a word to her about the witch's curse, and the king gave strict orders forbidding anyone ever to bring a spinning wheel into the palace or even to mention the subject of spinning. So the princess grew in happiness to girlhood. On her 16th birthday, the king and queen planned a celebration that was to outshine even the magnificence of the christening. Nobles of the highest rank were invited, and the entire palace was decorated with a blaze of lights. The perfume and colors of the flowers were matched in beauty only by the robes and jewels of the guests and the elegance of the banquet tables. The princess was radiant in a gossamer gown that shimmered like dewdrops in the sun. How happy she was, and how gracious to all the guests. After the feasting, there was dancing, and those of the young noblemen who had the honor of dancing with the lovely princess felt themselves fortunate indeed. In the midst of the heat and excitement, the princess felt the need of getting a little air and of being alone for a time. I know what, she said to herself. I shall go up into the topmost tower of the castle. It will be cool there, and I shall be alone, and able to look out and see the stars. Difficult as it was, she managed to slip out of the great hall unnoticed. Light as a bird, she skipped up the many flights of stairs to the tower. She had never seen it before, and she thought it quite exciting to be going there now, alone. The sounds of merrymaking from below growing fainter and fainter. At last she reached the top, or what she thought was the top, but there were no windows through which she might look at the stars. To her amazement, she found herself in a turret entirely walled in except for a tiny door. Timidly, she opened the door and found that it led to a steep flight of winding stairs. Lured on by her curiosity, she climbed the steps and came upon a strange sight. There, in an ancient tower, sat an old woman, so old and so deaf that she never heard anything that went on in the castle below. She was sitting at an antique spinning wheel, spinning silken threads of many hues. The princess was fascinated. What is it you do here? She asked, her gestures and her friendly smile showing the deaf old crone what she meant. I am spinning, my dear, replied the old woman. How interesting! Exclaimed the princess. May I try? The old woman was only too willing to let the princess sit at her wheel, but being quite untaught at the spinning art, the princess went about it awkwardly. And just as the wicked witch had predicted at the christening, the spindle pricked the princess's finger. Immediately the girl fell in a dead faint on the floor. Greatly alarmed, the old woman screamed loudly for help. Soon the babble of excited voices and the scuffle of shoes rose up the stairs. Led by the king and queen, the great crowd of noble men and noble women, courtiers, ladies in waiting, and palace attendants jammed into the tiny turret. When they saw the lovely princess lying as if dead on the floor beside the spinning wheel, they knew that the evil witch's ancient curse had begun to work. They tried in every way they knew to revive the girl, but in vain. They could not bring to life so much as the flutter of an eyelash. So the king and queen had the princess carried down to her own room. Maids of honor laid her gently, robed just as she was in her shimmering gossamer gown, on her royal bed of exquisitely carved woods hung with curtains of transparent cloth of gold. In her perfect beauty, a smile of heavenly sweetness on her lips as she lay motionless on the bed, the princess looked indeed like an angel. The king and queen were, of course, shaken with grief, but they felt it their duty to bid the guests return to the banquet hall and continue the festivities. But the spirit of merrymaking had faded away, and even as they danced, they did so with hushed voices and to muted music. After a while, the king and queen, heavy hearted but with a royal sense of courtesy, came slowly down the grand staircase to join their guests. Just as they entered the great hall, in through the window flew the princess's seventh fairy, the one who at her christening had decreed that she would not die, but would sleep for 100 years instead. Of course, fairies always know instantly what happens to their loved ones, even in the most distant parts of the world. So, this fairy, who is deeply interested in everything that happened to the princess, arrived at the palace as soon as she knew that the girl had fallen into her death-like sleep. Seeing the stricken faces of the king and queen as well as the guests, the fairy took in the whole tragic situation at a glance. She realized that if all these people grew old and died, as they naturally would within 100 years, the princess would be terribly frightened and lonely when she awoke. There would be nobody she knew to talk to, nobody at all, in fact, except, of course, the prince, but she wouldn't know him either. The fairy decided then that everyone and everything in the palace should also remain for 100 years just as they were at this moment. Then, when the princess awoke, she would be among her relatives and friends and in the familiar surroundings she knew and loved. Quick as a breeze, the fairy touched with her magic wand everyone in the palace, and as she did so, each became instantly frozen in 100 years' sleep. She touched not only the king and queen and every guest, but all the palace attendants, from royal ladies in waiting to the smallest errand boys, and even the stable boys, the horses, dogs, and cats, the food at the banquet tables, and the vegetables and flowers in the gardens. Everything and everyone familiar to the Sleeping Beauty princess was so touched with magic as to remain motionless, exactly as they were for 100 years. Then the fairy flew away, but not until she had caused to grow all around the palace and its gardens a thick forest of trees so tall that nothing of the palace could be seen from outside except the very top of its highest tower, and that only from a great distance. Then, to make it still more secure, the fairy surrounded the forest by thickets of bushes prickly with thorns and briars, and walled by a matting of thickly entwined vines and roots. So dense were the thickets, and so high the trees, that the palace was completely protected. Now, just as the palace and all its inhabitants had lain in this magic sleep for very nearly 100 years, a young prince in a neighboring country was approaching his 20th birthday. He was a lad dearly beloved by his people, for he was not only handsome and brave, but good and kind as well. All his life he had heard mysterious stories of the enchanted castle, whose tower he could see on a clear day high above a forest of tangled trees and briars. Many a knight, curious to know what might be within, had tried to penetrate the thickets, but each had perished in the attempt. But the prince, younger and more courageous than the others, had made up his mind that on his 20th birthday he would try. Stories had reached him of a beautiful young maiden called the Sleeping Beauty, asleep within the castle, waiting for a worthy prince to awaken her from the spell a wicked witch had put upon her, and the prince hoped he would be the one to do so. True to his determination, the young prince set off bravely early on the morning of his birthday. He whistled gaily as he approached the dense wall of thickets and forests surrounding the castle. Looking about him, the prince felt daunted, but suddenly a marvelous thing happened. In the twinkling of an eye, the heavily intertwined branches untwined, and the tall trees bent gracefully apart, leaving a narrow opening through which the prince could enter the path to the castle. They closed immediately after him, so that no one else might follow. Narrow and winding as the path was, the prince followed it faithfully, glancing neither right nor left. At last he found himself in the courtyard of the castle itself. Flowers of the brightest hues, trees and shrubs of every description flourished in the gardens, but it was as if they were made of wax. Not a leaf, not a petal moved. At either side of the doorway, two courtiers stood on guard, their rifles rigid over their shoulders, but their eyes were closed and their legs motionless. Birds perched in the trees and squirrels decorated the stone stairs, but there was neither sound nor stir from any of them. The prince, bewildered indeed, entered the castle door and saw within it what looked like waxen images of a great celebration in progress. There, motionless, yet with the flush of life on their faces, were great numbers of knights and ladies, nobles all, as well as courtiers, servants, flower girls, and all manner of royal guests at what seemed like a very gay festivity. At one end stood a king and a queen, dancers about to whirl away in a waltz, musicians bent over their instruments, servants passing great silver trays of party food and party drinks all stood like statues. In every room, the prince saw the same kind of scene. Excited beyond bearing, for he felt he was nearing the object of his quest and the solution of the mystery. The prince leapt up the stairs till he came to a room as rosy pink and snowy white as a blossoming apple tree. There, in the very center of the room, was a royal bed of carved wood hung with cloth of gold curtains, and on it, deep in sleep, lay the sleeping beauty princess. She was the loveliest, the most exquisitely beautiful girl the prince had ever seen or imagined. Rapturously, he knelt by the side of her bed and kissed her tenderly on the brow. Instantly, there was life, sound, and motion everywhere. The sleeping beauty drew a long breath, smiled, and opened her eyes. "Oh, my dear," she exclaimed as she saw the handsome prince kneeling at her side, "I knew you would come." At once, the musicians went on with the music they had suddenly stopped playing so many years before. The dancers went on waltzing. The servants continued to pass their silver trays of food, which was as fresh and delicious as though it had just been prepared. The prince helped the princess, who was still in her exquisite gossamer ball gown, down into the great hall where her father and mother, the king and queen, were overjoyed to welcome her. The prince asked her parents then and there for their daughter's hand in marriage, and they consented readily. Indeed, at the prince's request, the festivities, which had begun 100 years ago as her 16th birthday party, were continued now as a wedding feast. And so the prince and the sleeping beauty princess were married and lived happily forever after. The end.